Hello, my name is Laura Van Pate. Can both of you state exactly what you did in the building process for Camden Yards?
You should go first, David.
Okay. Um, David and I were among many, many other people involved in the initial planning and master planning, um, the decisions as to where the stadium would actually be built, and then as it got into the actual detailed planning, we were both from different perspectives involved in the site planning and the design work and the coordination of transportation improvements and programs that were swirling around Oriole Park at Camden Yards. My perspective, I was coming at it from the point of view of having been an employee at the Maryland Department of Transportation. Previously, I worked in the city in transportation issues, so I had some familiarity with the city as well as with MDOT programs. David, more from the point of view of being one of the designers, one of the engineers at the company RKK, which was doing a lot of the site planning work and previous studies, which we should talk about because they're really fundamentally the most important thing that happened in relation to Oriole Park was the decision to build it at Camden Yards, and all of the transportation issues related to it were greatly improved just by that one decision. So David can give a little bit of background as to how that decision-making process happened. That's a little bit long-winded. I'm sorry.
Thanks, Laura and David. So I worked at RK&K my whole career, started there in 1973, retired in 2020. And after the owner slash thief, Robert Airsay, stole the Baltimore Colts and moved them out of town in the Mayflower trucks on March the 28th and 29th, 1984, there was a tremendous amount of angst about what to do, how to keep the Orioles happy. A lot of their crowd, a lot of their attendance was coming out of the DC market. So there, as David said, there was a flurry of studies. There was the Baltimore Memorial Stadium Modernization Study, which came out in April of 1985, about a year after the Colts were stolen. That study focused on let's rebuild Memorial Stadium. We can make a great home for the Orioles there, great location, et cetera, et cetera. It's tried and true. Shortly thereafter, actually 6 months later, in December of 1983, there was called the Baltimore Stadium Study, which David and I often referred to, and others referred to as the Buddha Report, because the committee was chaired by Hank Buddha, and I think at the time, Laura, he was the president of AT&T here locally. And so they had some help, and they came up with a recommendation for Camden Yards. They looked at a couple other locations, but they recommended Camden Yards. And then shortly after that, in January the 28th of 1986, there was a, quote, new stadium site evaluation, end of quote, which many of us just referred to as the Mannequin Report. Bernie Mannequin was, I think, the chair of that committee. That was a state-sponsored report. The previous report was primarily a city-sponsored report. So all these reports are floating around. Rebuild Memorial Stadium, build a new one downtown, build a new one out in Lansdowne or Nursery Road. So the firm I was with and myself got asked to sort of lead a 3-team effort and do a 90-day study to assess which was the preferred location. And unlike David Chapin, I was not a policy person. I was an engineer. So that was a little more than we really thought we could stick our neck out to do. So what we did instead is we said, all right, if you choose to put the stadium here, this is the cost of the improvements that you need to do, and these are the operational characteristics. But the policymakers can make that policy. So we provided, as best as we were able, the facts for the operation of Memorial Stadium going forward, the operation of a new stadium at Camden Yards going forward, and the operation of a stadium at Nursery Road going forward, both in terms of the time to fill up the stadium, how to get access, the time to unload it, and what those access improvements need to look like. So there was a briefing then that I made to a joint session of the legislative branch and the governor when the session was still in track. And I can't find that date, Laura and David, so I don't really remember when it was, but it was sometime late March, early April of 1986. So that sort of calmed the waters and provided some clarity. And then after that, we were tasked with, all right, go collect a lot of data this summer, which we did on both the Orioles operation, finding out where their fans come from, how do they get the stadium, and also what's the data for the Major League Baseball throughout the United States. So we worked with representatives from MLB and came up with data so we could know what's the appropriate time for loading and unloading a stadium, a ballpark. And so that report got published in November the 14th of 1986, which we called it the Stadium Access Study. And that then, as David said, sort of led to the decision, and with the strong support of William Donald Schaefer, to putting the new ballpark at Camden Yards. And that was the start of my involvement. And then I stayed involved throughout the process all the way until opening day at Ravens Stadium, almost a decade later. So does that answer? Both of us gave long answers, didn't we, David?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Laura, back at that time in the 1980s, perhaps even extending a little bit further, but certainly in the 1980s, there was a debate, not only between government people and policymakers and owners of the Orioles, but also a fairly big debate among the general public as to where it would be best to have a new stadium if a new stadium was going to be built. And there were a fair number of people who thought, we don't like the congestion, quote unquote, that is inherent in a stadium within a city. They remembered lots of traffic going down 33rd Street, it being operated both directions of 33rd Street in towards the stadium before the game, both directions outbound. And there was the perception that that would be even worse if a stadium were located in the middle of a downtown area. So there were a lot of people who thought, let's build a new stadium out in the suburbs in a big site that has the possibility for 20,000 parking spaces, right, which was the way a lot of stadiums had been built in years just prior to that. They were, on a beltway or on an interstate highway. And everyone thought, well, if it's on an interstate highway, that means I'll be able to get to it really quickly. And that will be more convenient than if the stadium is downtown. And that debate, ironically, the perceptions were exactly the opposite of the reality. Right. So the decisions to make, to have the stadium built downtown in the Camden Yards area ended up being the single most important factor of the level of convenience and ease of access for people going to and from Camden Yards. And it surprised the heck out of a lot of people when it was opened in 1992, because the public expectation would be that, oh, it's going to be just jammed with traffic, it's downtown. And it turned out to be quite the opposite. And that really, that didn't account for the popularity of Camden Yards. The stadium itself and the Orioles accounted for the popularity of it. But it certainly made it an easier thing for people to love and enjoy when the stadium was opened up. And I will, I'll say perhaps a little bit boldly that fundamental decision, which was certainly in response to then Mayor Schaefer's very clearly stated desire to have the stadium be downtown, that it was his effort to do that and to make sure that the decision was made to build it downtown. That really sealed in place, just that one decision, made it far more easy for us to then figure out how to operate the transportation system around it. So I think the in this accolades need to be laid at Schaefer's feet in regard to this one issue.
Yeah, I agree. Once he became governor, then he was able to pull the levers of government power and move this forward as well. Now, Laura, what other questions do you have for us? Because
So,
we'll talk all morning.
so was I-395 already in the planning for Camden Yards, or was the light rail too?
The light 395 was built, and David could tell you a great history about that, but that was built and operational. Ribbon cutting for that had been a while earlier. Central Light Rail had been talked about for a long time, and it was broken out as a project from the original six-legged master plan for subway transit and got converted to light rail. Again, as David just said, I would lay the credit for that emphasis and acceleration on William Donald Schaefer for being an advocate for getting the Central Light Rail, a 22.5-mile single-track system, up and running for opening day.
Yeah,
David, do you remember what year 395 opened?
395 was opened, I think, in 1977 or 78, maybe 79, but in the late 70s.
Right.
And its design was obviously set when it was built, and it turned out that it was fairly compatible with the idea of putting a stadium in that area later on. But at that point, when we designed I-395 coming into the city, we didn't know that there would be a stadium there.
Right.
So there had to be some adjustments later on when the decision to build the stadium there was made. There were some relatively minor adjustments to 395 to make it work even better.
Right. Very minor.
And then light rail, that project was under construction at the same time that the stadium was under construction. And more or less, I don't remember the precise dates, but more or less the service was inaugurated simultaneously with the opening of Camden Yards Baseball Stadium.
So next, I'm wondering, how did you begin to coordinate traffic, transportation, and parking for a project this big?
I'll take a stab at that. In the early days of the planning of Oriole Park at Camden Yards, which once the decision had been made to build it there, once the Maryland Stadium Authority had been created as the agency that would build the stadium, would finance it and build it. Once that decision was made, there were subsequent decisions to have a fairly comprehensive master planning effort for the entire site, making the specific decisions as to exactly where the stadium would be, whether or not the B&O warehouse on Utah Street would be retained in its entirety or in part. There were some people who thought it should be torn down. So that master planning effort began probably in 1988, maybe very late 87, but certainly in 1988. And that involved representatives of the Stadium Authority. They were working under contract for the Stadium Authority. But obviously, all of the related agencies, all of those who would play a role in the stadium, were part of that master planning. David, I think you were involved with the consultants doing that.
Yes.
I, at the time, was working at Maryland DOT headquarters, doing policy and governmental affairs work for MDOT. And there were several people, the then current Secretary of Transportation, Dick Traynor. I had worked with him for many years. A previous secretary, Bill Hellman, who had left MDOT in 1987, and at that time was on the board of the Maryland Stadium Authority. The two of them together thought that it would really be good if we had some permanent representative of the transportation agencies involved with the master planning effort and involved with the Orioles and the Stadium Authority. So they asked me to do that, and that's how I became involved. What ensued from that was a lot of coordination among the Baltimore City, the City Department of Transportation, improvements that they had to make, various improvements that had to be made to the light rail system as it went through Camden Yards, to the MARC commuter rail services, bus services. There were improvements to the highway system that needed to be made. So first step in all that obviously was to sit down as part of this master planning effort and say, what are the things that we need to do in order to integrate the transportation system into this project, and vice versa. Once those were identified, then it was pretty clear who would be best to make them. The city had improvements to its road system, which David can talk about in a little bit. The state had improvements to be made on its facilities. And then we had to arrange the financing for all of that, and then actually design it and build it in time for the opening day.
So, Laura, David mentioned earlier kudos to William Donald Schaefer, and I think it bears discussion here that as unprecedented as it may seem today in this dysfunctional government, I believe that the cooperation, the level of cooperation among city, quasi-city agencies, state agencies, and the federal government, as well as the Orioles themselves, was unprecedented. And there was a level of excitement and commitment among staff at all the agencies, as well as on the design side, the architects and engineer teams, that had everybody feeling like it was opening day every day. And decisions got made by consensus, but they got made timely, and run up the flagpole, and off we went. And we don't see that kind of a level of cooperation today. But it was certainly a unique time, and I think it was sort of the philosophy from William Donald Schaefer, do it now. And everybody was gung-ho, and the Orioles were part of it. You're well aware, Laura, that the Orioles retained Jack Smith to come in and help. But everybody sat around the tables and discussed and made decisions. And at the end of the meeting, you walked out with an action item list. And the next meeting, you better have your action item list done and started the next one. It was quite an incredible experience.
David, did you move away from your microphone a little bit? I couldn't hear you as well.
Me too.
Oh, I put my earbuds in because my wife came upstairs to do a Zoom call as well. So I joined. Is that
your voice is muted? It's very faint.
Oh, well, I'll have to take these things back out. I'm sorry.
That's better.
Cool. So the next question I have is, how did you work with the MSA to determine how much parking space was needed?
That was a fairly interesting debate. Many in the major leagues, the owners, the people who ran teams for them, obviously and understandably wanted to have as much parking as possible. And that, by the way, was one of the reasons, or one of the factors in that debate that I mentioned earlier, between those who thought that stadiums in suburbs would be better than stadiums downtown because they could have a bigger parking lot associated with the stadium if it were in the suburbs, whereas if it's in a downtown area, the availability of immediate on-site parking is sometimes reduced. But there were probably some in the Orioles who thought they wanted to maximize it. They wanted to have more. There were other people who were saying, let's make it a reasonable amount to not have a huge site dedicated only to parking, but to have a good, reasonable amount, and then rely on the other transportation systems, the light rail, MARC, buses, as well as the tens of thousands of spaces that were available throughout the city. And it was a debate back and forth between Larry Lucchino, who was the president of the Orioles at the time, Bob Aylward, who was one of his right-hand men involved in the day-to-day design work related to the new stadium, and city officials and the stadium authority's board. And what we eventually came up with was the site as it is currently configured, which I can't remember, David, the initial amount of parking was maybe 6,000 spaces, something like that, if I recall correctly.
If you count the future football stadium site, which we used to parking.
Right. And then the stadium authority, once it knew exactly what the boundaries would be with that parking as well as the stadium, once the decisions had been made about keeping the warehouse, then the stadium authority went about actually purchasing all of that property. But it was a debate, a fairly enthusiastic debate, and I think the end result was pretty good. I mean, it would have been a shame to have had a sea of parking on 100 acres or something like that. And again, the fundamental issue was the stadium. The decision was to locate the stadium at the edge of downtown, which meant that you could rely on the 50, 60,000 parking spaces within downtown. You could spread people out when they were arriving. They didn't all have to arrive at the same place, go into one entrance into a stadium parking lot. They could arrive 3 or 4 blocks away. They could go out to dinner first and then walk to the stadium. And by spreading people and automobiles out into the downtown area, as well as on the stadium parking lot, it really facilitated the best access in and egress out.
Laura, I'm sure you're familiar with the tremendous debate about keep or tear down the warehouse, are you not?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So to reinforce David's comment about parking, the Buddha report, the one HOK, Air St. Gross, and Wilbur Smith prepared in 86, showed the warehouse gone and literally a sea of parking. I believe the number from that study, David, was about 8,000 parking spaces. And once the decision was made to keep the warehouse, the brilliant decision to keep the warehouse, which was the right decision to do, we then had to come up with more creative solutions for this parking, just as David described. But I think the early model in some people's minds was sort of the Arrowhead complex in Kansas City, which is 2 ballparks, each single use, surrounded by a sea of parking. And that's what people thought we needed here, even though it wasn't a suburban site downtown, but that's what they thought. And so, David, I would suggest that decision to retain the warehouse then changed the Orioles' ability to stick to their 8,000 number, and we continued to work with that and come up with a reasonable on-site number that left a good site design, an aesthetic site design, a site design that could handle stormwater management and that kind of thing, as well as all the fans coming to the game.
So next question I have is, then Baltimore Mayor Kurt L. Schmoke, I'm probably not pronouncing his last name right, was
you got it, Smoke.
Smoke was worried about traffic jams around the stadium. How did you work with Smoke or his staff to avoid that problem?
Well, a number of things happened. First of all, in the integrated planning effort that we had that involved MSA, the Orioles, the various state agencies that were involved in transportation, and the city, that the city was very much involved in that. So the people who were in the city's Department of Transportation were involved in the planning process and were intricate members of the decisions about where the access points would be into the stadium parking lots, how much we would try to rely on parking throughout downtown, and things that we could do that would make driving through the city, into the city, more convenient and try to minimize the congestion that might otherwise develop. One example, this city and MSA and the state agencies decided that it would be good to have variable message signs in various locations on approaches coming into the stadium, so that in advance of making a decision as to whether or not to try to park in the stadium lot or park somewhere else, a driver could know that the stadium parking lot was already full, figuring that that would fill up before, well before the game time would begin. So they could then make a decision. I'm not going to go right up to the stadium parking lot and then be told I have to turn around. They could make the decision 5 minutes beforehand. So we put up variable message signs. I think there was one on Martin Luther King Boulevard. We had one on Lombard Street. We had one on I-83. And we used
95 too.
95. We used the ones that were already in place on I-95 to be able to put up real-time information about how, whether or not the stadium parking lots were full, use alternatives, so on and so forth. And I think the city administration, by being involved in all that, were satisfied. Mayor Schmoke might have mentioned at one time or another, everybody at one time or another mentioned the issue of congestion. But I don't think that turned out to be a really big concern on his part because the city was so much involved.
Yeah, I remember that being more of an issue. Bill Tanton, the Sun Paper's columnist, who was always amping up about congestion downtown and used to beat me up whenever I'd see him because our kids were in school together. I don't remember Kirk Smoke being angst about it. I spoke earlier, Laura, about the incredible level of government coordination. So amongst everything that David just said, there was also sort of like a control center in the stadium, actually in the ballpark itself, special room. And around that room were people from the city, people from the state, people from the transit agency, people from the police, people from the state police. And they were all sitting there all in one room watching monitors and cameras and could instantly respond to traffic delays or traffic congestion. And I think it was like an orchestra of a symphony. It was actually music to have all this traffic arriving downtown. I thought happily and peacefully. We were all rather pleased, David, as you remember, after opening day.
Yeah,
we had set the bar sort of, we thought, high on how smooth it was going to work, and it exceeded our expectations. The quality of the traffic flow in and out was amazing.
And Laura, one other thing that we did, and this I think is credit mostly to the Maryland Stadium Authority and their board. We realized that the public had a perception about whether this was going to be a lot of congestion or whether it was going to be easy to get into it. And we realized that the public's perception erred on the side of fearing congestion developing. So we instituted a public relations campaign that started, I think, probably in maybe January of 1992, 4 months before the stadium would open. And that public relations campaign, which was magnificently done by Trahan, Burden, and Charles. Sandy Hillman was at that time, I think, the president or vice president of Trahan. And Alan Charles and Brent Burkhart were also very much involved in it. That public relations campaign acknowledged right up front that the public was concerned that it might be congested. So we decided to make a point of that and emphasize that by saying, if you are concerned about congestion, and we didn't say there won't be any congestion, we said, if you're concerned about there being congestion, then consider the following things. Take light rail. Take one of the express bus routes that we have developed just for this stadium. Park at a distance from the stadium in one of the garages in downtown, over near Harbor Place. Have dinner at Harbor Place and then walk to the stadium. If you're coming from the Washington metro area, take a MARC train. The commuter rail system comes up from Washington, and it has two lines, one of which goes right into Camden Station. The other goes up to Penn Station. Take the MARC train into Camden Yards, and there'll be a train waiting for you after the game is over. On the express bus program that we developed, there are various park and ride lots throughout the region that are normally used. People commuting downtown, they will take a bus from those lots and then take the bus downtown. So we said, let's use them. We'll have MTA buses go from those park and ride lots directly to the stadium, and we'll reserve spaces immediately adjacent to the stadium so they can get off that bus and walk directly into the stadium. Matter of 50-yard walk, something like that. And then at the end of the game, they can just get back on that bus and they will be whisked out either by I-95 or Martin Luther King and JFX. They'll be whisked back home. They'll get back to their car in short order. And we laid out all those options for people, knowing that there was concern about congestion. And a lot of people actually took that to heart and decided to ride light rail or take these express buses. They were very popular in the initial years after Camden Yards was developed. That reduced the amount of automobile traffic on the streets. The fact that cars were being parked 4 blocks, 5 blocks away by people arriving at different times. They didn't all arrive just 20 minutes before game time. Spread the traffic load out throughout the city, and it made it work much better. That expectation, as I said earlier, that expectation was actually the reverse of what we suspected would be the case. We suspected this was going to operate fine, but we played up on that expectation through this public relations campaign so that the public itself made decisions about how they were going to get to the stadium. The whole symbol of the public relations campaign was a little moniker that TRB developed. Root, 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 R-O-U-T-E, root, root, root for the home team. And then it laid out all these different options, and it worked.
So the meeting's about to end in about 5 minutes. I only have like the mini Zoom or whatever it is that lets you have 40 minutes. So I have one last question for you guys.
Sure.
So I've read that the state was worried that the light rail might not perform well enough on opening day and fans would be frustrated. Were you guys holding your breath, or were you pretty confident?
The short answer is we were pretty confident, but we were not leaving any stone unturned. We practiced all of this in advance before the stadium opened. There was a couple of days when the public was invited to the stadium to watch the Orioles practice. We had the system up and running for that, to practice it, to make sure that it would work. We did back and forths on the light rail line to make sure. MTA did that no matter what. I mean, they didn't need the stadium as an incentive to make sure that their system was operating properly. They were on top of that. So we were not overly concerned about that, in large part because we knew that people were really devoting a lot of time to making sure that it worked.
Cool. Yeah, and also, what did you have in mind for easy access to public transportation to the stadium, such as trains and buses?
Well, part of that, the bus system, the express bus routes, I've already talked about.
Yeah.
I mentioned that we had MARC commuter rail trains coming up, and the light rail was obviously instrumental in all of that. From the beginning, we knew that we had to put together a plan that utilized urban transportation options in all different varieties. And by making the public aware of that, we thought it would help to make the access to the stadium even more efficient. I think it worked.
Nice. Yeah, thank you so much, both of you.